Why is it so important to carry out searches for unmarked burials located at former residential schools? CUTV spoke with Nina Segalowitz, a coordinator at the Southern Quebec Inuit Association.
Nina Segalowitz, originally from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories.
Wonderful, thank you. And what do you think of the conferences that are taking place this week?
The conference is really super important because we're talking about the burials and the children who we have yet to find. I'm a navigator at Southern Quebec Inuit Association. And for me, I've been working in the community for 30 years, and I've been working with the community members who have been directly affected by the intergenerational trauma from residential schools and the 60 school. And for me, coming here is really, it's empowering in the sense that we got, so far I've listened to the police, the different Indigenous police services, whether it was in Ganasdage, Ganawage, or Tutune territory. And I've also listened to the survivors. And it's been an emotional few days. There's one more day to go. But a lot of the times, as the frontline worker or a community member, there's a feeling of helplessness sometimes, the day that those 215 original babies were found. And I called them babies because those are our babies, no matter what age. And being a mom and a grandmother, I see all children as sacred. And since those original children were found, more have been found over time, and we're over 10,000. And there's a lot more thousands left. And so having a conference like this really is empowering because I can see our community and our communities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, coming together and really being the ones who are guiding the process. For a long time, our lives were affected by the other being the Canadian government, social services, medical, justice center, justice services. And so conferences like this not only gathers people from different communities together, but there's a sense of sister and brotherhood that you leave with, and here we're standing next to a sacred fire. And I was saying, yesterday there was a moment where I was really emotional during the opening ceremony. And I just thought, wow, our babies who were buried because they died at residential school or were killed, our missing and murdered women, our trafficked women, those who are no longer with us and are in the spirit world, they don't get to do ceremony. They're part of our ceremony. And for me, it was a double-edged sword in the sense that they didn't get to do those ceremonies and they didn't get to share the gifts that they were born with. And we lost that, along with a lot of other things. And yet I look around the room and all I can think of is how strong we are. How strong we are. We are still here and we're fighting for them. And, even in Montreal, there's different sites, whether it's at hospitals, the Royal Victoria, the different hospitals that during that time were a part of, for example, like children were sent down to Montreal, to Ottawa, Quebec City, Winnipeg, all over Canada during the TB through epidemic. And so a lot of the babies were buried next to the hospitals and the parents were never told. So there's so much more work, and I think that there's still resistance, in different organizations, whether it's universities, hospitals, records, anybody holding records. They don't want to give us the information that we need to put our children to rest and our community members to rest, and that's unacceptable at this point. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to say, I'm as a mother and grandmother, if my child is missing, you better give me those records because I have a right, and I think that the fact that we're still fighting for the right to know the truth is unacceptable, and I think that it should not just be us, the Indigenous community members who are fighting, but it should be all Canadians who see it as unacceptable and demand that records be given and burial sites be protected, especially when there's construction going on. Just stop. Never mind the money, never mind, progress. You need to understand that this is sacred ground until we say otherwise, because you're on our territory.
A moment that kind of stuck with me in the conference that we attended is talking about jurisdiction, and I've seen that come up a lot. Of like, no, it's municipal, it's provincial, so and so. Do you think that in Quebec we face a kind of added barrier because our premier is denying that systemic racism exists? Do you think that this kind of plays another role in actually seeking justice and support in unmarked graves?
Oh, I think it absolutely does. And I think not only him saying that or them saying that or whoever in the government who agree with him or do not denounce him, give space to those who can also say they deny it. So it becomes, if he doesn't say there's systemic racism, then it just affects all the services, the ones that I spoke to, youth protection, health, social justice, schooling, everything is still working under the pretense, and they can say, well, it doesn't exist. And the minute that you do not accept that there's a problem, you cannot change it. And he doesn't speak for me. Even though I've been living in, I was scooped up and I was stolen from my parents in the 70s, and I grew up here. He doesn't speak for me. And I know for a fact that he doesn't speak for many people who disagree with him. And I think that, we can't wait for the Prime Minister or the ministers or the government to make changes. I think that the change really happens right here. You interviewing me, you giving me a voice, huge step, because our voices were not always considered and included in the process. And I think that media has a lot to do with telling the truth, and as Canadians, we can no longer deny that our children are buried and that there's still places. And I think that denying whether there's systemic racism, denying whether there's, social problems, whether there's anything, from not, the fact that we're still fighting for drinking water in communities. If there's a boiling advisory in Chateauguay, where I live, or in Montreal, there's a hoopla and people can't, they're counting down the minutes. We've been counting for years, and I think that there needs to be a shift now, and it's unacceptable, and there's no excuse for people not to know our history, the reality and the truth of what's happening in our communities. And honestly, if he denies it, it doesn't, him saying that there's no systemic racism, it's like saying, well, like the Holocaust didn't exist, or there was no slavery, or, people know that it's the truth. The fact that, for example, like Joyce Echaquan, her reporting blew that wide open and proved that what we've been saying for years exists. So I think that as community members and as Canadian citizens, we need to make that change for ourselves and not wait for ministers and prime ministers to make that change for us. We need to just make that change and build the relationships that we need to do. Like I do a lot of cultural teachings, so I've done cultural training for the Montreal Police, for the Canadian Army, for graduating lawyers, nurses, because I want them to walk away with an understanding of not only the truth of our trauma, but the strength that we have, and that we cannot live in a bubble, in the sense that we can't stay in our communities and heal ourselves. We need the major systems that we work within and that we receive services from to also walk beside us, and not wait for that to be taught.
Thank you. Lastly, I just wanted to ask, what can non-Indigenous Canadians do to help provide support and push the government to actually provide proper resources and
establish change?
Like I said, I mentioned earlier, as Canadians, can't wait for the government, and do your homework. When I show up and ask people how many nations are there, how many different First Nations are there in Canada, people don't know. How many First Nations are there in Quebec? Don't know. There's 11. There's 52. Um, what territory are you on? We're on Mohawk territory. People don't know that. And I think that you have, as Canadians, we have a right to vote, and we have a right to demand change, and Canadians can use their voice as non-Indigenous people. And sometimes the government will listen to non-Indigenous people more than Indigenous, because if we speak up, then we're seen as radicals. When we stand up and protect our land, we're seen as radicals. When we stand up and protect our women, we're seen as radicals. When we demand that, sites be, dug up and their remains be honored, we're seen as radicals. So I think that Canadians can educate themselves. Google is there, not everything, but there are search engines, and there's you can go to communities and ask what the truth is, honestly. And you can attend conferences, and you can come and speak to the leaders, and you will hear the truth, and then you decide what you're able to do. And it doesn't, the vote, the having a right to vote. We didn't always have the right to vote. As an Indigenous woman, as an Indigenous person, so people have the power to change that. So,
Thank you, Nina.
yeah.